Hello, this is Luis Angel Mendoza, and this is my chapter presentation on Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America by Juan Gonzalez. I am doing chapter 9, Colombians and Panamanians, Overcoming Division and Disdain. Part 1. Colombia and Panama, this is what the chapter was about, Colombians and Panamas and how they immigrated to the United States and how they were affected by the Americans, by the USA government. So this was the history leading on, or testimonials on how the immigration happened. Some of the important events in this chapter, we have 1903, President Teddy Roosevelt calls Panama independent in order to build a transcontinental canal that would connect the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean or to the Caribbean. He called Panama independent from Colombia to build this strip of land. The Panama Canal was not begun by the Americans, and it did not begin in this year. It had begun earlier by the French, but they were defeated by the yellow fever, or a disease caused by the mosquitoes. In 1914, the opening of the Panama Canal. Even though most of the jobs were finished, Americans overstayed their visit, and they stayed on a piece of land known as the Canal Zone, which suffered a segregation between the West Indies who had been there to work on the Panama Canal and the white Americans who were there in riches and power. April 9, 1984, we have the assassination of Jorge Eliezer Gaitan. Jorge Eliezer Gaitan was a liberal leader who got assassinated in the day known as El Bogotazo. After his assassination, various events around the city of Bogota, Colombia, rose up as fires, riots, and a lot of killing happened. This marked the beginning of La Violencia, the war, a 10-year civil war between the liberals and the conservatives. In 1954, we have the Brown versus Board of Education. This, during the time after the Panama Canal was built, the Canal Zone kept open as the Americans stayed their visit, and they had Jim Crow laws also up. Events like the Brown versus Board of Education, that schools started to come together instead of teaching the West Indies and teaching the Americans in different schools. Although the inequality didn't stop, West Indies particularly knew English, so in order for them to not attend the nice schools, the Americans changed their schools to Spanish to not allow the West Indies to enter those schools. In 1955, we have the New Canal Treaty. This treaty hurt Panamanians more as they were now forced to pay taxes for the first time. So they were called citizens of Panama, the West Indies particularly, but now they had to pay their taxes and still no access to the Canal Zone. In 1957, we have the end of the Violencia. Even though it ended a 10-year gruesome war of just pure violence, we had the same numbers of deaths as the American Civil War. Even though Colombia's population at the time was 7 times less. Well, America's population was 7 times more that of Colombia during the Civil War. So the same amount of deaths does not equal the ratio. It was far worse than this American Civil War. In 1959, we have the Panama riots begin. Since they had no access to the Canal Zone, the Panamanians started fighting back. They started rioting. They started putting their flag around the American flag, causing a greater issue. In 1977, we have the Carter-Trujillo Treaty of 1977, which, in order to avoid another Cuba revolution, the President of the United States called a treaty to allow the Canal Zone to be decoccupied and given back to the Panamanians. 21st century Latino similarities of Latinos mentioned in the chapter. One of the biggest similarities, or the two biggest similarities I see, are Latinos are still immigrating. Latinos are still fighting for safer homes, stable jobs, and higher paying jobs. What does this mean for me? This means for me that we Latinos are not settling for less. If they see a better opportunity, they will take it. They are ambitious. They are They have goals, they have plans, they have a survival instinct. So whatever is the best for them is what they would take. Whatever options they have is what they will be taking. Julián Eliezer Gaitán, one of the important people here in the chapter. His birthplace is Bogota, Colombia. Date of birth, January 23, 1898, and date of death, April 9, 1948. His assassination marked the beginning of the civil war in Colombia between the liberals and the conservatives. These liberals were most guerrillas, conservatives were mostly, they had the military. But before that day of his assassination, he worked for fighters' rights, and he was also known for El Gaitanista, which is a series of programs he wanted to include when he was the mayor of Bogota to help out the workers and help out the farmers and everyone, making sure they had enough pay, they were eating well, that they were living in stable conditions. Some of the keywords here in chapter 9 are holgazaneando, which means arresting innocent civilians to occupy cells. As called by Vincent White in this chapter in his testimony, he became a police officer, and whenever the jails or the prisons were empty, they would go around the city looking for people just walking around, for pedestrians walking around, and arresting them for loitering, just for fun, or just to pass the time. And also as a form of racism, since the Americans were the one ordering these rules. The Canal Zone was a strip of land ruled and inhabited by the Americans in Panama. Again, it was a part separated from the Panamanians, meaning that if you were from Panama and you wanted to get a mango from the Canal Zone, you were not allowed. You were chased and beaten by the police. The Pájaros were dangerous armed conservatives that killed suspected liberals. So the Pájaros were a sort of group of armed conservatives that would go around killing farmers who were suspected to be liberals. They would go around killing political leaders, just causing havoc amongst all of Colombia. The Rabiblancos, the tiny white elite who traditionally ran politics in Canal Zone. So this is a way of how the Panamanians called the people in charge of the Canal Zone. Guerrillas are a group of armed individuals with unusual warfare tactics, meaning that they were not as big as military, but they were still armed and they would go in and out in fast attacks, just causing disorder. So they couldn't fight straight up, power with power, so they would do sneak attacks, they would do attacks at a shortly mannered, timed attacks that would not require a lot of people. They also had mulas. We also have mulas, which are drug carriers. So this was used by the cartel to carry on drugs around the country or around the world. Sicarios are assassins, again hired on the cartels. So if the cartels needed someone to be quiet down, sicarios would be hired. Coyotes were people smugglers, so they were people who would send people into other parts of the world, smuggle them into other parts of the world, most specifically known here in Mexico, as they were taken into the United States as immigrants or illegally. Los Nuevos Ricos was the Colombians' nicknames for new, poor, and undocumented immigrants. The first wave of Colombians were more richer white people who valued education and land, and after the war began, the violencia began, more poor people without an education started to come in. So they would name this Los Nuevos Ricos, as in the status of being an immigrant change. Boom towns are towns that grew rapidly. So when the violencia was happening, they would go into different cities in the United States that would grow overnight since the overwhelming power of the immigrants that were coming in. In part 3, one of the ethical dilemmas we have is living in the hometown or immigrating somewhere else. So throughout the chapter, we have a pattern or a theme of whether Latinos would stay in the home country, in the place that they grew up, where it's maybe unsafe, unstable, doesn't have the best resources, but where the culture's also at, where the traditions, where their motherland, you could call it, or whether they had to immigrate somewhere else and leave that all behind to find the better life, to find a better jobs, to find more money. So it's an ethical dilemma amongst both the Panamanians and the Colombians. For the Colombians specifically, most of them were people who had money. Most of them were people who were educated. Uh, they would travel into cities. They had opportunities. Um, so they would have to travel. Some of them would still choose to leave the United States to keep their family safe. To keep the family safe, meaning that they would have to leave on their own careers behind and find different careers here in the United States. For Panamanians or the West Indies, most of them speak English, so living here meant that they would have to come here and not fit in with Latinos here, since most Latinos here speak Spanish in the United States. So it was an ethical dilemma that they had to resolve amongst each other to see whether they would have to leave or stay behind. This is a video on the Panama Canal, 1904.
When asked about his plans for Panama in 1904, an ebullient Teddy Roosevelt declared, "I'm going to make the dirt fly." But first, he sent an Army doctor, Colonel William Gorgas, to eliminate the yellow fever epidemics that had doomed earlier French efforts. Gorgas declared war on the local mosquitoes, and within a year, the yellow fever threat was gone. Then, workers under the command of Colonel George Washington Goethals blasted and dug their way through the Cordillera Mountains, carving a 9-mile-long canyon called the Culebra Cut. For over 6 years, the giant steam shovels dug without pause, filling a railroad car every 8 minutes. The trains rolled as far north as the mouth of the Chagres River, where their loads were used to build the gigantic earthen Gatun Dam. Lots big enough to lift battleships were built at the Atlantic and Pacific ends of the canal. Finally, on June 27, 1913, the dam was closed and the largest man-made lake in history filled, flowing into the Culebra Cut, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans by a slender but navigable thread.
Alright, so this video represents, it's talking about the building of the Panama Canal. But again, this only speaks about mostly what you hear from history channels and discovery channels, whether on how the Panama Canal was just this great invention, this great investment by the United States. But again, you don't see in the picture any picture of the West Indies, who were mostly darker skin color. You only see white Americans working in it. You only see the big machines and all that stuff, and you don't see how many inequalities there were where the Panama Canal was being built. Alright, thank you. That's the end of our presentation. Thank you very much.